All right. Well, welcome everyone. And we're so happy to have Lucy Beadnell back with us again. She is here to talk about housing options. Just as a reminder, you are all muted, so please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A and Lucy will get to those. And also as a reminder, this presentation, along with the recording of today's webinar, will be posted later today on our transition series Padlet. So with that, take it away, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for having me. As she said, I'm Lucy Beadnell with the ARC of Northern Virginia. I'm here to talk a little bit today about housing options that are available in Northern Virginia for people with developmental disabilities. I would say, as we go into this presentation, having a mindset that is more like, I want to have a general sense of what's out there. I want to get some direction about what might be a good fit, would be a good goal. This is a really complicated topic, in part because good housing options should really be highly customized to the person with a disability. So, as best I can, I'll speak about things that are general. But it's just impossible to talk about a subject as big as housing and all the things that are tied or not tied to it in the time that we have, or to absorb it in one sitting, no matter how much time we had. So, kind of go in today with an open mind, ask as many questions as you would like, and we will learn and then go from there with other ways to keep forward with the learning. All right, so first I'm going to talk about the difference between housing and services, which are different things, and we'll talk about what that means when I use those terms. And then I'm going to talk about housing options that don't have included services and how you could get them otherwise. And then I'm going to talk about options that have housing and services coupled. Then we're going to talk about between these two set of broad ideas, which might be a good way to find the right match, and a little bit about troubleshooting, and then ways to learn more about housing options. Oh, I'm not sure why, but a lot of the graphics from the slide are missing. I've never seen this happen before. Huh.
Uh,
Oh.
can
What
you?
if I share but don't put it in presentation mode? Does that
Oh,
work?
yeah, I can see that. That's perfect.
Okay. So it's not like it just is weird to have the words floating there. Okay.
That's
So when we talk about what we need to be successfully housed, it's rare that what we literally mean is the house only, the bricks and the mortar and the light switches and the pipes, right? What we're usually talking about is we need a house, a physical place to live. But in the disability community, we're also adding on what are the supports that go with that? Who is it who helps stock the fridge and make the meals and pay the bills and get people up and help them be successful throughout their day, those kinds of things. And then what are all the things that are related to our housing, the transportation that gets us to and from, the recreation options when we leave home, our job, all those other kinds of parts of a good life. So when families ask us about housing, I think it's really important at the beginning to just understand we've got to build all of these parts: the physical place to live, the supports and helpers, and all of the other things, like I said, like transportation and recreation and all those other sorts of pieces of life. Housing isn't just one thing. So families will often say, where do I get on a waiting list for housing? Right? And what I'm trying to explain here is the the conversation is significantly more complicated than that. What we're really trying to look at is how do I build a durable, successful, supported place to live that meets the needs of myself or my loved one. So, oh, this is different to navigate now that I'm in this mood. Okay. So, usually when we talk about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we're realizing that they are going to need some significant supports throughout the day or throughout the week to be successfully housed. Because even if we gave someplace a great home, if no one is there to help with those day-to-day tasks and taking care of the person or supporting them and learning how to take care of themselves, it's not going to work. So, what we're going to walk through today is what is the housing part? What does that really mean? And what is the services part? And how do I combine them, or can they be combined or moved around? And there are lots of different ways to come at this. And I'll say, as a parent, initially that feels miserable and overwhelming because who in God's name wants to hear, like, here's 15 avenues to explore how to do this. But I will say, I've been at the Arc of Northern Virginia a number of years, and when we first began talking about housing, really there were only like one or two options. And if we think about the incredible array of people out in the world and the incredible need continuum for people with disabilities, to say that for thousands and thousands of people in Virginia who have completely different needs and preferences, we only have two choices was a terrible fit. So I'll just say, as a silver lining, there is a gift in the fact that this is somewhat overwhelming at first, and that gift is because there are choices. There didn't used to be choices. We're doing a lot in Virginia to try and change the continuum of housing options that are out there, recognizing their continuum of people and of interests and of needs and of desires and all of those kinds of things. But that does mean sometimes instead of thinking we are signing up for housing, so to speak, and everything's going to come all tied together with a bow, it means we're really looking at custom building each part of housing, the services and the house and the good life pieces all together. And you may be applying for those things at different times or in different ways. We may be thinking about a backup for the housing, the bricks and mortar, for example. Maybe the ideal is the person with a disability stays living in the family home forever. But perhaps we explore backups that are accessible apartments or using their special needs trust to buy a condo that's custom fit for them or what have you. And maybe our ideal is a parent is the caregiver or a sibling is the caregiver forever, but our backups are we have a live-in caregiver, we have drop-in caregivers, all these other kinds of things. So we're going to be working on how to fit all these pieces together, sort of like a puzzle. Um, when we talk about separating housing and services, by that I just mean choosing a home that means if you live here, you get to choose who helps you and how much and how. When housing and services are tied together, you may pick the home, but you don't get to choose the staff or the housemates. Or you may pick the staff that you like or the company that you like, but then you don't get to choose where the home is or who's going to be there, those kinds of things. So when we talk about choosing a home, the physical home in which you live, let's break through some ways to fund that choice. One option that's really popular is the state rental assistance program. It's modeled on Section 8 or housing choice vouchers that are fairly well understood. It means that the person with a developmental disability who has a waiver, is eligible for a waiver, etc., is going to pay 30% of their income towards rent, and this voucher assistance program will pay the rest up to a reasonable cap that's based upon the area where you live. So in this way, the person with a disability can take that housing voucher and say, hey, I've got essentially a coupon to pay for housing. They can shop it around to apartment complexes. There are dozens in our area that has a leasing preference to rent to people with developmental disabilities. They got a tax credit in exchange for doing that. So it is absolutely possible to find some real options. Person with a disability says, this is where I want to live. This apartment complex meets my physical accessibility needs. I can get to transportation to and from here, and I'm going to pay for it with this state rental assistance program coupon, for lack of a better term. And that option is great because it's really flexible. That coupon, that voucher, belongs to the person with a disability. If after a year they think, actually, I'd love to live in that apartment complex down the road where my best friend lives, they can take that voucher with them. And so long as the other apartment complex accepts it, they could move there. They could say, I need this voucher to pay for a second bedroom because I need a live-in aid. And I mean the voucher to pay completely for the cost of that second bedroom. There's no cost to the person with a disability. And then they work on finding a live-in aid. The live-in aid gets free rent. The voucher is paid for it. In exchange, they provide some services, right? And here you've had total choice of where you wanted to live and who your aide was going to be, or caregiver, whatever term you want to use. And so the nice thing here is, let's say you want to change your caregiver, you don't have to move. You would just say, it seems like this situation's no longer working out. That person doesn't have the same tenancy rights as a roommate. They're just an occupant. And so you would say, you've got to go. A new person has got to move in, or they change jobs, or they move away, or what have you. It means you don't lose your house if your support staff changes. With an option like this, you can choose if you want to live with roommates physically in the space or within the same building or within the same block, right? You choose how much of your life you want to be tailored to the existing needs and interests you have. And over time, as those things change, you can change your situation. You can use that voucher to move to different places. You can move closer to friends or roommates. You can encourage your friends or roommates to get a voucher and to move into the apartment complex with you. Those kinds of things. Um, it's a really fantastic way to make sure that supports are customized to the person. And if there's ever a risk of losing one part of it, which is usually the staff, right? The staff moves on to another job or what have you, that you don't lose all of it. Still, the person knows the transportation routes from that apartment. They can still live there. They can still pay the rent there, all those other kinds of things. Losing one piece doesn't upset the whole apple cart. Um, the housing choice or the state rental assistance program, like I said, is modeled on housing choice vouchers. And I usually mention it first because it's only available, like I mentioned, for people who either have a DD waiver or are on the waiting list for a DD waiver. So the competition for it is small. Usually the waiting time to get a voucher like that, you'd reach out to your community services board. You'd say, I'm interested in these housing vouchers. And they're going to say, are you ready, willing, and able to move within like 60 to 90 days if you get this voucher? Because it's possible you could get this voucher in a handful of months. This isn't a get on a list and wait for 15 years, which I feel like is what we're so used to in our community. This is a, are you ready to go? And if you aren't, how do you get ready to go? How do you create a budget? How do you start thinking about the furniture you're going to need, the caregivers you're going to hire, the apartments you'd like to tour, all of those kinds of things? It should start to generate those sorts of discussions. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that program is modeled on the housing choice voucher, like I discussed, all throughout Virginia, Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Prince William, blah, blah, blah. They all have housing choice vouchers, and that works the same as that state rental assistance program, but instead of just being available to people with developmental disabilities, it's available to any low-income family. So as you can imagine, there the competition is really, really fierce to get a voucher. It can be much harder to do. So the state rental assistance program works exactly the same. Both of them have the person with a disability pay 30% of their income toward the rent. The voucher covers the rest. State rental assistance program is usually the way to go because it's so much faster to use and because it's tailored to people with developmental disabilities. They're very used to people asking for things like a second bedroom for a live-in aid, a ground floor unit because they need it to be accessible. Those other kinds of reasonable modification or accommodation things that our community needs, essentially everyone with SRAP is asking for. um, there are other options. One in Fairfax does this more than any other jurisdiction called public housing. And in this situation, the county owns a whole apartment or condo complex. And you're on a waiting list to get into that complex, again, based upon being low income. So the waiting lists are massive. Usually you can't even get on the waiting list. They open them once a year or once every few years for you to get on the waiting list. And then you wait for many, many years for this to be offered. Again, in comparison with SRAP that you can get pretty quickly and with relative ease, public housing is an option. It does all these other things SRAP does. It lets you bring in your attendance. It lets you build a good life around it and make lots of choices, but it's harder to get. We do see some people for whom the SRAP voucher is not an option for whatever reason. It's not their preference. And we have seen more and more people with developmental disabilities doing things like renting a room in the home of a senior who's lived in the area and is suddenly facing limited income and very high property taxes, who's happy to have someone with a disability be on the premises. We see lots of really positive codependence where maybe the person with a disability becomes the person strong enough to take out the trash or reach the cups on the top shelf. Maybe we see that older adult who's renting the room to them be someone who can be kind of a de facto extra eyes and ears on them, a companion, those sorts of things. There are lots and lots and lots of rooms for rent in the area. And sometimes if someone doesn't have a housing voucher, that's the most affordable way to rent independently. You know, a one bedroom or even a studio apartment in the Arlington or Fairfax area can average $2,000 a month. And that's not including all the other kinds of fees and things that we know come with living. And so renting a room in a home, I just want to say, is usually far, far, far more affordable. And the more shared spaces, for example, shared kitchen, shared front door, etc., the cheaper the rental is. So that's certainly an option. We have also seen a number of families pursue the idea where either using the family home, parents have passed away or have moved out, or buying a home, purchasing a condo or a townhouse, that kind of thing usually is an option. The family owns that home, condo, townhouse, and the person with a disability lives there with a roommate that they choose, or live-in aides, or roommate plus live-in aides that they choose, and all those other kinds of things. The really nice thing about that option is that if the family has the means to purchase that home for the person with a disability, if the person with a disability is the homeowner, they can often get tax relief for doing that. It means that home is there for them and is going to be affordable because you own it, you choose what the rent is going to be for forever. There's never a risk that the building will be demolished, that they'll stop taking a housing voucher, that any of those other kinds of things will happen. Um, but it does come with all the other things that come with owning a home, right? Then you need to start thinking about who's going to do property management and all those other kinds of things. But that's kind of the very general idea. Here's some physical homes, bricks and mortar options, ways to fund to them, ways to get into them that allow you to choose who your roommates are, who your staff is, and to build a life around you. Now we're going to move on a little bit to how would you pay for those staff people who are going to come in and help you because it's not a cheap service. Um, there are a few options. I know we talked a couple of weeks ago about the Virginia waiver system. Medicaid waivers pay for caregivers. They can pay for live-in caregivers. They can pay for nurses. They can pay for 24-hour awake caregivers if you want to explore that option. They can pay for caregivers who come in and out of that condo on shifts. You could work out a situation where you and your roommate both had caregivers coming and they could help out each other, or they could do things for you that also happen to benefit your roommate. There's some kind of clever ways to work around that with waiver. But the reason we talk about Medicaid waiver so much is because the waiver never, ever, 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 by federal law, nowhere in the country, does the Medicaid waiver pay for someone's rent. It does pay for the support staff. And the waiver can be an incredible option for bringing any kind of support staff you need into the home. And one of the nice things about doing that with a home that you chose and paid for with your own money, Social Security benefits, plus a voucher, plus whatever it was that you had, and bringing waiver staff in is over time, if you grow more independence, you have a roommate who helps you out with more things, you can choose to use fewer waiver hours. Or over time, you have a fall, you age, your disability becomes more significant, then you can stay where you are and you can use your waiver to bring in more hours of care. So here we're kind of saying once we choose the home and stabilize what the home is going to be, you can use other tools to bring in as much or as little staff as you needed, recognizing that that's going to change over time. Lots of people living in their own home, by which I mean they've taken over the family home, an apartment or condo, something that they're renting, all those other kinds of things, use natural supports. Is that a roommate or someone in the building or someone down the hall or a friend? Natural supports just means you're not paying them otherwise. Who helps you out, right? Our immediate next door neighbor has a wife who has advancing Alzheimer's. He is an older person with physical disabilities. So we, as neighbors and people around, are happy to do things like help cut grass, shovel snow, pull trash cans up and down the driveway, those sorts of things. He's able to stay in his home in part due to natural supports. Just like we all have bits of community. So don't take that for granted. I feel like we're constantly being surprised by the wonderful people in our area who are willing to dedicate time and energy to help. So as you start thinking about how this is going to work, don't discount some of that happening. If someone doesn't have a waiver, private pay can be an option, right? You choose to just hire someone and pay them a fair market rate to come in and do that kind of work. And maybe over time that person gets a waiver and all that changes is who signs the paycheck. They start billing their hours to waiver instead of billing their hours to you, and you haven't had to change the house or even the support person. If the person with a disability has money that they have saved, inherited, earned, etc., through a special needs trust or ABLE account, you can certainly use those kinds of funds to pay for support staff. And like we alluded to a little bit ago, sometimes folks are really good at bartering a free second bedroom because they bought a two-bedroom condo because they used a housing voucher and asked for that second bedroom for free, etc., for live-in staff. And that staff doesn't have to pay rent. And in exchange, they offer a certain amount of hours of service to the person with a disability. Oftentimes, that looks like the live-in aid has to be there between, I'm making up hours, 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. They can be awake or sleeping. And as parents, you're probably sleeping a good portion of that time each day. But they're there if the fire alarm goes off, the person with the disability has a fall or cries out in pain, there's a weird knock at the door, something unusual happens. They're essentially on call, right? And able to help. And maybe in addition to that, their job on Saturday for 4 hours is to go out and do a fun activity in the community. And when they go grocery shopping, to go grocery shopping together and to do some weekly meal planning and help with budgeting, right? Free rent doesn't buy you a full-time staff person. We don't work full-time to do nothing other than pay our own rent, but it certainly does buy you some hours of support. And there are lots of ways to think about bartering there. So you've got this live-in aid who's offering some support, is there overnight if a person doesn't need someone awake, and you're doing that essentially for free. Okay, so now we're going to pivot. We've been talking a lot about housing that you choose and how to bring in support people that you choose. And you can fund that housing in different ways, and you can fund those support people in different ways. That's the 10-second summary of where we've been. Now we're going to talk about situations where housing and support services are linked. These generally come through the Medicaid waiver. And what I mean is, in these situations, if you decided, I don't want to live in this house anymore, I got a job across town, yeah, you can move across town, but you can't take any of these support staff with you or these roommates or any of the other services you have here. You've got to start over with a full package deal on the other side of town. Or you're living in a house and it's going great, and a roommate moves in who doesn't like you, who you don't like, who is loud, who is disruptive, who takes your stuff, who wanders the halls at night, who's driving you up the wall, then you don't have the right to ask that person to leave. If you aren't getting along with them, you have to leave. The benefit here, though, is instead of having to find the home and the support staff and the transportation and all the other pieces and add them together, it comes as a package deal. And just like buying a package deal of anything, there are pros and cons, right? In some ways, it's easier, especially up front. In other ways, it's harder because you get very little choice and customization in a lot of cases. So I'm going to talk through some of those Medicaid waiver housing options now that link all of these pieces together. One is the very traditional group home model. In Virginia, this usually means 4 to 6, can be more, people with disabilities living in a home together. Generally speaking, every person has their own bedroom. There can be exceptions to that. Generally speaking, the people who are living in that home did not choose one another. It's pretty common for group homes to have single sex homes, not always. This is a female only house, a male only house, etc., for obvious reasons. But that's not always the case. Having worked in group home services, I'll tell you, group home providers absolutely try and work to make sure that the people living in a home will live cohesively together. It's very difficult to know whether or not that's going to work until you've tried it, right? So sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have people with very different ages or energy levels or interests cohabitating, and sometimes that's fine because opposites attract and it all kinds of balances out. Sometimes it's not fine. Maybe 3 out of the 5 people living in the home are much older and they don't like going out and they find it overwhelming and exhausting. And we've got some younger people who really want to go out and see sports games or play sports themselves or go to events and all those other kinds of things. And we've got 2 staff on duty trying to decide with our 1 van and 2 staff, do we send the van out with the 2 people who want to go out? What if they want to go to different events? And then how do we redivide ourselves? Or what if there's someone at the home with physical support needs who needs 2 staff to lift them? Well, then we've got to go places as a group, right? So when families often ask about housing, they usually have the group home idea in their head because Virginia was heavily reliant on this residential model from the 70s to some degree, but especially from the 1990s to, the 20 teens. It's all we'd heard about, and it was pretty much all that there was to see, with rare exceptions. So it may be something that we ask about at first. And so here I'm just trying to share that term may sound familiar. It may seem like a great fit. In some ways, it can be because things are packaged together, but there's a lot to navigate that can be very difficult to change in a group home environment once you're there without picking up and changing everything all at once. There is a waiver option called independent living. And in this option, the person with a disability is living in, think a shrunken group home, an apartment. Usually in this case, they've chosen their roommate and they've chosen how much staff they're going to have coming in. And with independent living, there's a cap of 21 hours a week of caregiving that the waiver is going to provide. So that really is a good fit for someone who maybe can be alone and likes being alone or is going to navigate themselves out to get on transportation, to go to work, to go do other things, etc. But maybe you need someone to come by every day for a couple of hours or at least a couple of times a week to do things like pay the bills, do the meal planning in the grocery shop, do the deep clean, whatever that is, right? That's an option that's out there. There is another waiver option that links housing and services together called sponsored residential. That's probably the second most common after group homes because it's been around for a long time. And in a sponsored residential situation, the person with a disability is generally moving into the home of a caregiver. So I think examples are easier here. So let's say I was a retired or a 50-year-old special education teacher. Maybe I do or don't have my own kids living at home, but I think what I do have is a spare bedroom. I enjoy being around people with disabilities. I'd be happy to have someone with a disability live with me. And so I would go through the process of getting my home licensed. I'll show that there's a fire exit, that I'm bonded and insured, that I've done these things. And then someone with a disability could come live. They would pay for the sponsored residential service with their DD Medicaid waiver. And much like a live-in aid, I could sleep overnight theoretically if the person needed a regular rotation in the bed, bathroom help overnight, what have you. Fine. But the expectation would be we're kind of living more like a family unit. We get up and we do things together throughout the day. I might help that person get up and go to work or get up or go to wherever it is that they go to volunteer or do meaningful things during the day. We come home, we have dinner together. We work and spend time together. Absolutely, the person with a disability can still have actively involved family that they come and see and all those kinds of things, but it really is more like a family living environment. In sponsored residential, there's a maximum of two people with developmental disabilities that can live in the same home. I more often see it with one, that the caregiver has one person with a disability move in. But here, of course, much like with the group home, if you decide that caregiver is not a good match, you have to leave the home. It's not your home, it's their home. Or if that caregiver can no longer do the work and they quit, those kinds of things, then you have to be prepared to start all over, finding another kind of home-like environment that's as accessible and essentially located in those other kinds of things. Um, there is a waiver option that the ARC of Northern Virginia is working really hard on to get higher reimbursement rates because right now, in so many ways, it's ideal, but it's hard to find because the reimbursement rates are so low. And that's supported living. And that would usually be a situation where the person with the disability on their own is living in a condo or apartment, or maybe they have one or two roommates that they chose. These are friends who decided to live together. You are absolutely choosing who you live with and whether or not you want to live with someone. And in supported living, you can have staff there up to 24 hours a day awake if you needed. So it's sort of the benefits of the group home in that everything's packaged together. There's an agency overseeing, they're providing their own backup services and backup staff and all those other kinds of things. You can get as many hours of care as you needed. You get to choose your house, you get to choose your roommate. But here the hitch is, like I said, reimbursement rates for this service are so low, it's hard to find. I will say to families, if you have a DD waiver, it is phenomenally important when you are doing your annual waiver plan to say, what we would really like is X. Put that in the plan. Even if it's not available, write it down because without that, there's no data created that shows the state people want this service. We should put more money and more energy here. They just say, oh, it turns out people are just requesting the same old thing. I guess it's fine that in the whole state there are 50 people living in supported living. No, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then there's also a waiver service called shared living that is used rarely. Is more like a live-in aid where you and the aide are signing a lease together and living together. It's a little bit different than the SRAP option where we talked about, because in that situation, the person with the disability is the only one who's signing the lease. The rental is in their name, and even if they have a live-in aid, they can boot that live-in aid if they want. With shared living, it's a little less flexible sometimes. Um, so as we think about what option might be right for you or for your loved ones, I think now I can go to bigger screens. Um, I would say thinking about things like, is the ability to choose roommates important? Or is this the kind of person who can truly live with anyone? Any energy level, any personality, any daily schedule sorts of things. Is it important to this person to choose their staff based upon experience or personality, etc.? Or is this the kind of person who anybody's fine? They're easygoing. Is this the sort of person who wants to live alone or maybe with one other person? Or do they really thrive in larger, louder environments? We've got some of all of those in our household here. Is it important to be able to change the services the person gets over time, to add in more or less support at home, or completely different kind of support? We want to go from making your meals with you to maybe helping you make a list and observing and supporting verbally as you make the meals on your own, right? Do we want that sort of option for evolution? And then do you need help arranging for services and filling out paperwork? I think intuitively we can imagine that if you have a life built for someone where the housing is chosen for them, separate from the services, separate from the transportation, separate from everything else. In some ways, that's beautiful and perfect because it's exactly what the person needs. But we've got to have someone who's monitoring, overseeing, filling out the paperwork for all of that. And to some degree, it's a waiver case manager, assuming the person has one. But the reality is a lot of that work falls to family. So who's that person going to be if it's mom or dad now? And who's it going to be if this person outlives mom or dad? And then I would also keep in mind, you may have to try more than one option. So maybe you try living in a setting and you think, oh, this seemed like a good idea for me, and I can't stand it. It's too loud, or it's too quiet, or it's too lonely, it's whatever, right? Maybe the problem is it wasn't the right match. So let's take a group home as an example. Let's say you move into a 7-person group home and there's a big range of ages and interests, and you don't feel like you're getting one-on-one time with people you care about. You don't feel like you can go the places you want to go. Okay, maybe that means a group home's not right for you, but it definitely means that home isn't right for you. So you could say to that same provider, hey, XYZ home provider, do you have another home that's maybe smaller or where people like to do the same kinds of things that I like to do? Can we look at that as an option, or can you let me know if that opens up? Or maybe you say to the next service provider down the road, I like the shared living option, but the first home I tried wasn't a good fit for me. This is why. Do you all have a home that fits, right? So you can try different homes that the same provider owns. You try a completely different provider, or you can change services. Um, for typically developing adults, especially, and people with disabilities, it's rare in your 20s to move out and choose a housing and living option that never has to be changed for all of the rest of your life. I feel like as parents, as we are trying to think ahead about something that's durable, something that we know is going to be there for our loved one, that's what we want. That's the unicorn. I want to set it and forget it and know that forever someone's going to love my child and take care of them and be everything that they need. But the reality is, probably the things that the world offers and what the world looks like in the 20, 30, 40, 50 years that your child's going to be alive, it's going to be different. We should prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally and prepare the people on our child support team for the fact that we want to continuously evaluate where they're living and how they're doing. And we don't want to be afraid to make a change when other options become available, right? Um, no matter what, you would ideally have family or friends overseeing things. They pop by for a coffee. They come visit for birthdays. They go to annual plan meetings and advocate for services, those kinds of things. We can understand that in a service system that's really difficult to navigate and is underfunded, if we've got two people and one has people showing up for them and advocating and pushing for them and taking them out, that person's going to end up in a better place than the person who doesn't have any actively involved folks in their life, who's just going to kind of say, okay, this is all the choices that there are. I don't have anyone else to help me push along with this. This is what it is. Ideally, friends or family could do that. If not, you can hire advocates who would help check in on your loved one, help them push for other kinds of services. People independent from the waiver system is really what I mean in that sense, that aren't going to say, sure, let's just sign off because this is the best of what it is. People instead who are going to go in there and say, actually, I think we can do better. Could we get this service instead? What would this look like? Let's take a tour and to do some pushing. I'd say one thing that we are really trying hard to get away from in Virginia is this idea that because a person has higher support needs, they can only live in one kind of setting. That's not the case. In fact, Virginia has been involved, for many of you probably know this, with the Department of Justice and is under a legal settlement agreement that we have been under for more than a dozen years now. And that settlement agreement is so clear in pushing back on this idea that someone's assessment of your needs should forever determine where you can live and what you can do in your life. And in fact, the data that came out of that settlement agreement said people with the most complex needs behaviorally and medically tend to be served in smaller settings if they're going to be successful and stable over time. A sponsored residential home, a customized apartment, a live-in aid, or what have you. Because people tend to do better in settings that are completely customized to them, where they have maximum choice and control, which is sort of intuitive when we think about it. Oh, so we're back to all of the graphics on the screen disappearing. This drives me absolutely bananas. So let's go back. Okay, so here. In every setting, we want to be taking a good look at what are all the things that we can throw at this, all the pieces and partners and things that we can be involved to make sure that this goes well. Like I talked about, that's family and friend involvement. That's recreation. Is it the county's therapeutic recreation office? Is it a sports club? Is it a meetup group? Is it whatever? Social activities. Goodness, there are lots out there now. Free neighborhood groups, walking groups, clubs, all kinds of things, online, in person. Lots and lots of options. We want to be rounding things out because even if we say we want something like a package deal, like a group home, we want that person to have control and choice in their life and a chance to do the things that mean the most to them. How do we build community relationships? Is this person going to volunteer, be a part of a neighborhood group? Those sorts of things. How do we layer in work and volunteering, knowing that none of us fare well when we sit at home all of the time, no matter what? I think, oh, so we get asked a lot about how will I know if this is the right fit as a parent or an advocate? I would say trust your instincts. Um, ask, oops, all right, it's really tedious. Ask a lot of questions before consenting to a move. Um, what's important to the person? Can they still do these activities? What happens when there's a staff shortage? What happens when there's staff turnover? Who's going to help with this paperwork? Who's going to help do this? How long has the average staff person been here? Can I drop by unexpected, right? Um, those sorts of things, the more questions you ask, hopefully the more comfortable you'll feel and the better you'll be equipped to evaluate different options. Um, if something's not working, try and change the smallest amount possible first, right? Can we change just the staff or just the house or just some of those extra life benefits on the side to round things out? Because big changes over and over and over again are traumatic and terrifying for all of us, especially someone with a developmental disability who may not always understand why those choices are being made. Um, think about layering in extra supports. So if something's not working, is the solution we need new staff? Or we need extra hours of the same service, or we need a different kind of service? Do we need to add in mental health care, right? Really be prepared for a lot of troubleshooting. All of us are very different out of the family home, than we are in the family home. Every single one of us had different kinds of behaviors and different things that were important to us when we stopped living with our mom and dad full time. So there's going to be a big adjustment period. If you feel like there's a need for extra support, are you asking your waiver support coordinator? Can you drop by more? Can we meet more? Do you have a supervisor who's helped people with something like this before? We talked about the option to hire a private advocate if you want to. You know, lots and lots of involvement. Don't ever hesitate to reach out to the Arc of Northern Virginia with questions. And in terms of where do you learn more, Diane has shared in the Padlet, we have a big transition point guide on housing, which is a 70-page version of what I went through today. It also layers in how does housing intersect with things like the Medicaid waiver? How do I apply for that? And special needs trust and long-term planning and those kinds of things. But it really does talk through in a lot of detail the sorts of things we went through today in these slides. In our online resource library, we have housing one-pagers that are sort of the cheat sheet version of what we went through today and the cheat sheet version of that housing guide to give you a quick walking around sense of what the options are. And we have a lot of 3-minute recorded sessions that walk through some of those things like what's a housing voucher? How do I ask for a modification? How do I find an aid? Those kinds of things, as well as full length ones. Um, I just wanted to remind people that Northern Virginia is divided into 5 chunks according to the State Department of Behavioral Health that oversees waiver services. Northern Virginia's chunk is large. It's that whole yellow area on your screen that goes all the way down to Caroline County, which I do not especially associate with Northern Virginia, but we do have a tremendous local housing expert named Jeannie Cummins Eisenhower, who for years, many years ago, worked at the Arc of Northern Virginia. She's a housing expert. She is a resource to people with waiver or on the waiting list trying to navigate all of this. She and I can help connect you with other families and other people doing this kinds of thing. Um, and then I'll put some other resources there on the screen. But Diane, I know we saw some questions come in, so I wanted to go back and address a couple of those. Does a voucher count against SSI? What a great question. No, vouchers and SSI play very nicely together. So if someone is getting support to pay for their rent through a housing choice voucher, SSI does not consider that a resource. It will not reduce their benefits. It will not make anything more difficult with SSI. In fact, essentially everyone with an with SRAP housing voucher has SSI or some social security program. Those housing vouchers, like I mentioned, add up all of the income the person with a disability gets. It's SSI or SSDI and earned income from work and monthly settlement agreements or whatever it is. They add all of that up. And the person with a disability pays 30% of that total of their income toward the rent and utilities. The voucher pays the rest. So that's really the only way that SSI is taken into account, so to speak. It's counted as part of the monthly income. Oh, Diane, you're on mute, but I did see you mouth whether or not there were any questions.
Yeah, does anyone have any more questions? Please go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. And we've had Jeannie Cummins, I think that might be one of the links that you have. We've had Jeannie Cummins speak multiple times, and we have her recorded webinars on our YouTube channels. That's also a great webinar to watch.
Lots and lots of information is out there. Here's a good question. Okay, can SRAP, that state rental assistance program, the housing voucher program, be used if the individual with a disability lives with a family member or is just moving out of home? This is not an easy question to answer. You cannot use SRAP if you're living with your parents or grandparents. You could possibly use SRAP if you're moving out and your sibling, your adult sibling, is going to be your live-in aid. I've seen that happen, or your cousin, or whoever. But parents, including step parents and grandparents, can't be living with the person in order for SRAP to work. SRAP's whole intention is to create options for people with disabilities outside of the family home, where folks with disabilities used to get stuck and told that that was the only place they could live. Hopefully, you don't need rent assistance if you are living with your parents or grandparents, meaning if they're your landlord. Oh, sure. Anything else? It's tricky. I just feel like it's so hard to wrap your head around how exactly this would work. When I talk to families about housing, I usually say try and narrow it down to a couple of options, at least things that you instinctively think might be the best fit. And then it's a lot easier to start saying, okay, to explore this option, try these three next steps. And to explore those options, try these three next steps. And just kind of continue that information gathering process till you get down to the one best first place to try. How do you know if your child qualifies for SRAP? SRAP requirements are that the person has a DD Medicaid waiver or is on the waiting list for a DD Medicaid waiver. Essentially, those are the only people who are eligible for SRAP. It would be very unusual for someone in one of those situations to not be eligible, assuming they wanted to use SRAP for its intended purpose. What third-party organizations monitor group homes or sponsored residential homes? I don't know that I would really consider them third-party organizations. The best answer to what third-party organizations is, it's family and friends. They really are third party who really can drop in and check in on things. All group homes or sponsored homes, those kinds of things are licensed by the state of Virginia, which means there's an office of licensing that can do annual or more frequent audits or surprise drop-by visits. There's a state office of human rights that can drop by and check in on them. But really, those offices are under the head of the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, the state waiver agency, and the home is paid for by waiver. So I don't know that I would really consider it an independent third party. It's all part of the same system. Um, I speak with a lot of families who have adult loved ones, especially in group homes, who do not feel like those two systems alone are an adequate total source for monitoring. So hopefully you've got actively involved family, a good support coordinator who's checking in, friends, those kinds of things. Is there a general age for people to start with these housing options? Sort of depends on what you want to pursue. If you're thinking about an option where there's housing, it's an apartment, it's a condo, whatever, and you're bringing in support services, I would say it's never too early to start working on independent skills and life skills and learning how to make your own bed or toast or whatever it is that you're working on. Great. But in terms of actually pursuing, like I want to put in an application for this housing unit, this apartment program, this voucher, et cetera, I would say that would most likely happen within less than a year of you first expressing option in it, interest in it. So don't think, oh, I've got to put myself on a list now for something that happens years and years down the road. If you have a DD waiver, the type of DD waiver that will fund group homes and sponsored residential homes, you can find a group home or a sponsored residential home all but immediately in Northern Virginia. Are you lucky enough that that home that happens to have availability is a really good fit for your loved one? You know, that's if it's the very first home you check, I would say odds are low. Probably you're going to have to look at a few more options. So mostly, I would say if you're looking for an independent option, housing, like a housing voucher option, an apartment, a condo, et cetera, start looking about a year before you're ready to move, knowing it may go a little bit faster or slower. If you're looking for something like a group home or a sponsored residential home, first make sure you have the DD Medicaid waiver. Otherwise, there's no way to pay for those options. And start talking to your support coordinator and saying, hey, this is the timeline we're interested in. And if that timeline is we don't want to move for 3 years, it doesn't do a whole lot of good to start looking at things in tremendous depth now. But if that timeline is we feel like we're ready to move in the next relatively short period of time, we'd like to start touring housing options. And as soon as we find the right fit, we're ready to go ahead. That's when it's the time to raise that conversation, knowing it could go faster or slower than you expect. Is there a list of group homes in the Northern Virginia area? Not of all of the literal individual homes and addresses, but in that housing options guide that Diane put in that Padlet and then I mentioned, there's a big listing on pages 50 and 51 of the largest group home service providers in Northern Virginia. So you can see your websites. And each of those organizations has anywhere from a handful to multiple dozens of homes. So there are very, very many in Northern Virginia, right? A lot of that is matchmaking of is the home that's in the right location with the right kind of household personality and energy, a good fit for my loved one available at the right time. And so sometimes you'll tour a service provider and you'll say, wow, your philosophy and mine are completely in line. We would love to live in one of your homes. Is there anything available? And they'll say, no, but we can keep you posted on when things are. And sometimes you'll just start looking at any homes that have openings, especially if you need to move more urgently. There's not really a bad way to go about that. But I would say don't, knowing how stretched our service system is, the time to do that is when you're thinking about a move within the next year-ish, not a move 5 or 10 years out. Things are going to be too different by then. How do local CSBs matter in decisions? For example, if someone lives in Prince William, but our child wanted to work or live in an Arlington apartment or group home, how does that affect anything? It doesn't have a tremendous impact on it. Um, Generally speaking, if someone with a disability, we'll use your example exactly, lives in Prince William County, the home that they want to live in is in a Arlington. They have an SRAP voucher to let them move in. They've got their staff supported, lined up and all those other kinds of things. They make the move to Arlington. That's not a problem. There's no issue with Prince William County authorizing that. I've never heard a family say, oh, the CSB was so hesitant to let us move out of the county. Never once have I ever heard those kinds of things. I will say if your case manager is in Prince William County, they may just be less of an expert in options that are in other jurisdictions. Northern Virginia is relatively small. So in a lot of cases, these experienced support coordinators know a lot. So you may want to say, hey, is there anyone else on your team who's helped someone move to this area who could give some advice? Or can you tap into the Arlington CSB and see if they could meet with us and give some advice? But there's no real issue there. And then once the person with a disability has moved and settled in the new jurisdiction, after about 90 days, usually the case management switches. So again, in using this example, someone from Prince William County moves to Arlington. Then about 90 days later, Arlington should take over their case management. They know the local resources, they're able to get to the person quickly, those kinds of things, and vice versa. Your case manager should eventually be wherever you live geographically.
That looks like it might be it. And we are almost right at 1 o'clock. So, Lucy, thank you so much for all of that information. Um, and thank you all for joining us. And oh, let's see. Wait, is there one left? Oh, I just
Yay,
said it was
thank
very
you.
helpful. Um, so thank you all. As always, please feel free to reach out to either of us have questions, especially because I know a lot of people will watch the recording of this and not have Lucy live, but she is also always available to take questions. So thank you all.
Everyone